everyone, my name is Samantha Perez, and I will be discussing Federalist Papers numbers 45 and 46. I apologize in advance. I have to record this on my phone because my camera on my laptop is not working. Anyway, so Federalist Paper number 45 is titled The Alleged Danger from the Powers of the Union to the State Governments Considered, and Federalist Paper number 46 is titled The Influence of the State and Federal Governments Compared, which both are authored by James Madison. Sorry, I'm reading off of something that I typed up. In Federalist Paper 45, James Madison discusses that the powers of the national government given by the Constitution do not diminish those powers that are left to the states. Since the Union is necessary for the greater good of the citizens, state governments may partially lose their importance and dominance as a result. He attempts to prove that the federal government will be fatal to state governments, and points to the history of confederations and feudal states to support his claim. And when it came to confliction between central and local powers, historically, the local power/government succeeded. He goes on to argue that if there is any government that will become weak, it will be that of the federal government. So in order to prevent all of that, however, the Constitution must grant the federal government greater powers. These powers will also be different to those of the states, in that the federal government will deal mostly with times of war and danger, whereas the state government will deal more with times of peace and security. These powers are not new, though, as they are more of an activation of previously established ones that were already given to them by the articles. Most people during that time actually thought that the federal government was going to have more power and therefore overrule the state. But however, the point of the article is that the part of the Federalist paper that James Madison is trying to prove is that they're not getting more powers, they're just kind of activating some older ones that were already in place. The Constitution is not expanding these powers, rather it is simply providing them with a better way to put them into effect. In Federalist Paper 46, James Madison restates his argument that was previously stated in Paper 45 about how the powers granted to the federal government will not deter any powers given to the states. He begins by reminding and addressing audiences that it is the American people who hold a majority of superiority. Sorry, that word is really hard to say. Over both the federal and state governments. While these two forms of governments have different powers, regulations, and serve different purposes, it is the voters who hold the decisive control. State governments will not lose power, since it is they who remain in daily contact with its citizens and they who deal with the issues that impact their lives. To further prove his point, he goes on to discuss that, like state governments who remain biased towards their home county, so too will those representatives in Congress be towards their home states, which will aid in retaining power to states. He also mentions that if the federal government were to overstep any power that they may have towards the states, then these states, I keep saying states a lot, then these states will have a relatively easier time in resisting those actions by coming together to fight those federal government efforts. And it will be nearly impossible for the federal government to create an army big enough to bring down all of these states. By listing the tiring ways that the federal government would have to endure by overstepping any boundaries, goes on to further prove his overall point to the people that the states will not lose any power and will remain just as powerful. These Federalist papers relate to what we have studied in class so far, in that they deal with federal and state government issues and issues of power. In basic terms, these papers deal with intergovernmental relations, which is the overall objective of the class. To learn about intergovernmental relations, the whole point was that the whole point was just intergovernmental relations. I'm running out of time. Within the papers, James Madison discusses the powers of state and federal governments, and they relate to class, of course, by demonstrating the various ways in which the state and local governments deal with one another. Can't talk today. Let me see. In Paper 45, he discusses that the federal government will deal with times of war and danger, whereas state governments will deal with times of peace and security, which details their relative roles, responsibilities, and levels of influence, which is a general definition of intergovernmental relations as discussed in O'Toole's article for Module 1. By determining the fine line of what each government power will entail and its regulations/boundaries, it also relates to what we have learned from class by somewhat giving a brief example of the excerpts of the Articles of the United States Constitution. Within the article National State Relations 1987 from Module 2, the section titled Guarantee to the States discusses much of what James Madison discusses within his articles, which is that many constitutional provisions guarantee protection to the states so that national governments do not abuse or neglect them. Overall, though, the best way to distinguish how they correlate is to simply identify that they relate in that Madison talks about intergovernmental relations by having these two powers come together when needed, yet remaining separate when it comes to dealing with public issues within each state and not overstepping any boundaries. All of which is what we have been learning thus far. Those who oppose the Constitution and what the papers try to refute claim that too much power would be given to the central government. With too much power given, the powers would threaten liberties and fail to protect individual rights. They also assume that these powers would take away from the sovereignty. I cannot say that word. Sovereignty. Sovereignty. I cannot sound that out or say it ever. Anyways, but basically power of the states. Some also thought that these powers would then go on to create a dictatorship, much like that of the Great Britain, which they fought so hard to escape. All of which these powers were attempting to refute. In the papers, James Madison assures the public, though, that these powers being granted to the federal government are for the greater good, that these powers are to ensure happiness of all Americans, which, according to him, is the overall main purpose of the government. By continuing on, he counters any argument against these newly granted powers by stating that all that is being done is necessary for the safety of all Americans against foreign danger, war, and militaries that poison its very fountain. He also reassures them by stating that the states will remain just as powerful. Again, restating, even if more powerful. Okay, so let me start over. He also reassures that by claiming this overall statement, these states will remain just as powerful, even if not even more powerful than the federal government, and that all liberties will be protected by assuring the public that all governments shall have limitations and boundaries within their own respective jurisdictions. Again, not that I was reading the camera, but I was reading off of something that I had written or I had typed up to read. But anyways, so yeah, again, so I'm at the press. I read and wrote about Federalist Papers 45 and 46 by James Madison. Thanks.